Hi, everyone. My name is Abby Bangzer, and I'm super excited to be here today to talk to you about my experiences running Waypoint as a service across multi-cluster Kubernetes. The thing is what Waypoint focuses on is bringing value to end users. And that's what software delivery is all about. How do we get the value of an application from our laptops where we designed and developed it out into the hands of our users where there's value to be had? But what we have to think about is that there's actually this huge gap that we have to overcome between our laptops and that production environment where people are getting value from the software. And we overcome this gap with a number of tools usually that can solve our key problems. And I would categorize these key problems as how do you store your code? How do you build, test, and deploy that code, usually with like a CI/CD pipeline? And how do you manage that in production to confirm the quality and experience of your users through observability and monitoring? And this kind of gap between your local, where you're developing the software, and production only grows within an organization as the number of applications grow and change across different languages and different styles, and the number of environments on your way into production and across production change. So when you're managing different mobile and web environments and different test environments prior to production, this makes it even more difficult to think about what does it mean to take a change from your local laptop and get it in the hands of users. And this is where Waypoint comes in. Waypoint can help reduce the number of tools that we need to solve that gap. And that can be a really big improvement in the experience of an application developer. And Waypoint aims to give a common solution for all the application developers in your organization and across your different environments. So you don't need to think about if someone's writing a user interface versus an API, if someone's making a mobile app versus a web app. We can use Waypoint to be able to build and deploy and release those applications across your different environments in the ways that they need to be treated and managed. So if we make this a bit more concrete and we look at a specific application developer, they're sitting here, they're thinking about what that end user experience is, and they want to be focusing on that. But actually, that environment configuration of how they test their ideas locally versus what they'll look like in production can be a big challenge. At the most basic level, they're likely using a very different operating system locally as in production. So it's quite common today for software developers to be using Mac computers. I know I do. I have an M1. So not only is my complete operating system different than the Linux operating system that's common in production, but also I actually am using a different architecture, which makes things even more complex. And this is getting to be more common, not less, around software delivery. In addition, how you actually deploy that software can be different. Locally, I use something like Docker Desktop to get fast feedback as I'm trying to develop on a piece of software. That adds, I can even go before Docker and use things like yarn install for JavaScript. And these would be very different from how you might need to manage a scaled deployment in production, where you might need something like container orchestration that something like Nomad or Kubernetes can provide you. In addition, when you start looking at data, in production, data needs to be durable, it needs to be scalable. You may rely on something that is of high quality, like an Oracle database, whereas in local, you're looking at very different requirements. Yes, you want that data structure to be the same, but you're probably looking at speed to refresh the test data that you have in the environment. So you're probably looking at a very different tool there. Same thing goes for observability data. The durability and scalability of production may require something like Elasticsearch and Kibana, but when you're looking locally, you're looking for speed of feedback. You're likely looking at some log files, maybe using grep. You're also possibly spinning up open source tools like Jaeger to be able to get quick looks at your traces, but you're looking at very different environments. And these environments only multiply and become more complex as you add in more languages and you add in more environments. And as a developer, you need to be thinking about all of these different things for each of your different applications. It's quite common for a team to own more than one application and need more than one environment for that to be deployed to. And this is where Waypoint can come in and save the day. With a single waypoint.hcl file, you're able to configure it using the same configuration language across all your applications, how each application handles the build, deploy, and the release. So this is a very simple file. I'm sure many of you are using much more complex aspects of Waypoint, but I just want to get the basics out for people that maybe haven't used Waypoint yet. So with Waypoint, you have the ability to use plugins, and this can really simplify the experience for an application developer. One example is that under the build annotation, you can talk about either making Docker files or you can use Pack as a plugin. With a Pack plugin, you're using the cloud native build packs to actually build a deployable resource without needing to write a Docker file. And I don't know about you, but I know that Docker files in my previous organizations have always been a struggle for how do you manage it to be secure and how do you keep it small? And that the skills around and knowledge around how to write Docker files often aren't the same as the people that are writing your software applications because they're just different. The app developers are working in different languages. Using something like Pack can allow for a more secure, smaller footprint of an image without asking for all of that overhead to land on the application developers. You can use similar plugins when you get to the deploy stage. Here we're using the Docker plugin, which would allow for a developer to push their code into their local Docker environment on their laptops or wherever this is currently pointed at, and be able to see their application running after using Pack to build it. And this makes things really easy because the power of a Docker deploy, but with a single use of a plugin, reduces so much of that cognitive load on the application developer. But things aren't this simple. You have to be able to manage those different environments. That's the whole point. We need to be able to go from our laptops where we're using Mac and Docker into production where we're using Nomad or otherwise. And so that is all managed here in this Waypoint HCL file as well. So you don't have these multiple files and worrying about things. You're allowed to make switches and able to make switches on things like the workspace you're in. So we can be saying that Docker is the way we deploy normally, but when we're in production, let's make sure we use Nomad. And again, all of that gets configured here in this Waypoint HCL file. Now, the interesting thing about this file is you can still see that this requires some amount of expertise that is separate from application development. So you may find yourself sort of co-owning this file between the teams and the people that understand how the deployments work and how builds work, and how the application engineers know about their application and the environment variables they need and things like that. And that's the thing about Waypoint is Waypoint provides the common solution for an application team challenges, but it still has to wrap up all those challenges around operating Waypoint and operating those deployed artifacts. And that's when we start to talk again about this challenge that we have, where we have this gap between our laptops and production, where we need to solve it with tooling. And I find that giving that a name can help significantly in talking about what that solution might look like. And one of the names that I find most effective is the platform gap. Because what we're talking about when we're talking about code hosting and we're talking about CI/CD and we're talking about observability in production is we're talking about a platform to support the delivery of that software. And that is where we have to add that underlying layer that supports these three tools. Yes, you can have Git and CI/CD in operations, but you have to have some sort of tools. Someone in your organization has to manage those three tools. I'm using three examples. There's lots out on the market. You could use GitLab, GitHub, Bitbucket, all sorts of options for hosting your code. For CI/CD, Jenkins, Tekton, a million others. And same thing when it comes to observability, whether it be Grafana or Kibana or anything else. But what's interesting about these tools that we're talking about is some of these can be hosted in the cloud or on your own infrastructure. So a SaaS or software as a service solution is one where the software is actually running in your provider's cloud. GitLab, for example, does provide this, while they also allow you to run it on your own infrastructure. And you might think that running it in someone else's cloud, running it through a SaaS provider would completely remove the need for a platform. But actually, there still is some conversation there about how does your team access this service and what kind of extra configuration do you manage? It is a significantly reduced footprint, but there's still a platform that your team, your organization is providing to users within your organization when it comes to managing these services coming in from different cloud providers, different providers. That footprint goes up significantly when you introduce self-hosted. And so Waypoint is similar to that with the GitLab, where you have this option to use the SaaS hosted solution from HashiCorp, or you can choose to self-host the open source software yourself. And let me just say, if you can take on the SaaS option and work with HashiCorp's hosted solution, that is the way to go. Because while I say that you still need to provide a platform to your users, that platform has a significantly reduced footprint in the way of management from inside of your team. But there are reasons why self-hosting is provided as an option, and there are reasons why you may need to self-host your solution for Waypoint. And that's what I want to get kind of into for the rest of our time together here, is let's talk about the platform teams and how they can manage self-hosting of Waypoint. So when you get started with self-hosting, you're likely starting with the CLI. This is a fantastic one-click option, Waypoint install, and point it at something. If you use this to point at a server, you get up and running quite quickly with Waypoint, but you may run into some limitations because at this point, there's only a single server that knows about Waypoint, where only a single server can deploy your applications. This will obviously be quite limiting as your number of applications grows. So you're probably going to want to move to a more robust host for compute. So you may move from using that CLI tool to deploy to a single server, your own laptop or in the cloud, into going into a container scheduler like Kubernetes. And so here you have Waypoint server running on Kubernetes that has now access to deploy those applications to the whole cluster. And so you can manage increasing nodes and increasing support as the number of applications grow. But with a container scheduler comes the need to deal with resilience concerns, because in Kubernetes and other cloud providers, those are not guaranteed resources. They can be restarted and they can be removed and replaced. And that's true for on-premise or for a single server as well. It's just something that is built into the fabric of using these container schedulers. So you have to start thinking about that. In addition, you may catch that we're still using the CLI that's coming from a single operator's machine. Now, that is going to reduce the ability for the team to own and to change their Waypoint solution. And that's going to have some resilience issues in its own right. So you're likely going to move on from this if your team starts to grow. So one of my favorite ways to deal with deployments is to make it declarative. So instead of me making a command to do the deployment or the upgrade or the change, I actually produce the YAML files or the configuration files that can be deployed out to the server or to the cluster. Waypoint makes this really easy because they actually have a Helm chart that is used under the hood by the CLI tool. So there's no reason why you can't use Helm template, generate the files that need to go into Kubernetes, just like the CLI would, and store those in Git. You can then choose how those get from Git to your cluster, whether that be through a kubectl apply, or whether that be through a GitOps methodology that I prefer, because that helps make sure that you don't diverge from what's in your cluster to what you defined. This helps solve some of our previous problems, but it doesn't come without its own challenges. And when you start using declarative deployments, you solve a lot of problems, but you still have some that you might have to worry about at this stage. For example, you're still on a single cluster, so upgrading that cluster may be difficult without downtime. If you're not able to manage deployments across the clusters, then when you try and make changes to this, you are changing the one running cluster. In addition, in a single cluster, you have limitations to things like what versions of CRDs you can use and how locked down you can make permissions. There are reasons why you may want to separate your workloads across clusters into multiple clusters. So how would you manage that with a Waypoint deployment? You may want to look into a decoupled and scalable architecture that allows for a single Waypoint server to deploy and manage many different runners across many different clusters. This is built into the Waypoint architecture. You're able to register runners with the server, and they can be in other clusters. But you have some challenges when you start walking down this road. So first of all, we've already moved from that imperative CLI command into having this be a declarative deployment. But when you start having to register runners and actually adopt them into the server, you still have to use that CLI command to do that. You also now are starting to manage many different clusters, and there's challenges that come with that. How are you going to make this repeatable? How are you going to make this dynamic and scalable? And you're also going to have to start thinking about consistency, like permissions across these different clusters. What's that going to look like? And this becomes even more apparent when you start using multi-cluster, because you quickly see that what you want to be able to do is talk about clusters as cattle, not pets. You want to be able to bring clusters up, tear them down. This is particularly effective when you're talking about a test environment where you can use something like a vCluster or virtual cluster, which allows you to use a very small footprint to create a completely independent cluster and give permissions and accessibility to your application engineers without needing to give them a long-standing environment like production needs to be and the durability of that. So yes, I've said, if you can use SaaS, if you can use the provided solution from HashiCorp, that's the way to go. That's the way to go with any tool that you can use. But just because you can't use that in your organization doesn't mean you have to go it alone. It's really important to look for ways to lean on the community to make this whole process a lot more simple. And that's where I'd like to introduce Kratix. Kratix is a framework to try and help you make your platform, because only you can build your platform. Your organization has your own needs and requirements around security and cost efficiency and permissions and all of these things. And that's something that is hard to configure into a pre-configured platform, when actually you just want to put on top of all these fantastic tools your thin layer of business value. And so when you're building your platform, you actually have to be thinking about quite a complex domain. And this is where a framework can be helpful. We talk a lot today about platforms as a product. And I think it's important because just like a product in e-commerce or travel, the domain of platforms is quite complex. You have a user interface. That user interface needs to worry about things like what should the users be allowed to choose and under what validations. And once you let them start ordering things from your platform, what kind of ways can you make that easier and more built in for the majority use case and make those paved path options? Things like this might be that you provide databases as a service. Somebody wants to be able to get a database on demand from the platform. Well, what options are you going to expose? Could it be things like the size of the database? And you may want to put validations that make sure people aren't building huge databases for small test environments. But databases as a service have value, but what really has a value is an application as a service. And so this is where you start to compose the idea of a database and an application and Waypoint deployment and all these things into a paved path for your application. These are just some ideas that you might need to think about when building a platform. In addition, that platform requires all of your business logic. This is why you have to build this bit. This user interface's business logic is hard to find in a prepackaged solution, even if what you're pointing at below is prepackaged software like Waypoint. So within business logic, you need to manage things like the common configuration of software. For example, we talked about databases. You might require encryption on disk. You want security, you want that customization from the request of the user, and you need to manage those declarative and imperative actions for deployments. In addition, once you've had all this kind of pieced together into what it is you want to deploy for your user request, you still need to worry about provisioning that into your infrastructure. And that provisioning needs to be aware of what you have access to that could be quite modern, could be a container scheduler, or could be quite on-premise or otherwise. Infrastructure is not monotone. There's lots of options, and your provisioning needs to be aware of this. Also needs to be aware about how things change. What happens when a cluster disappears and a new one comes in its place? If we're treating things like cattle, not pets, the provisioning needs to be smart enough to make sure that it's managing the requests of the users and providing what's needed. And Kratix provides the framework to support that. We use an X as a Service CRD, which is a built-in Kubernetes custom resource definition structure to provide that validated user form. We provide worker cluster resources and pipelines to be able to manage all that complexity of your business logic. And we dynamically schedule to whatever infrastructure it is that you want to schedule to. And this kind of stack shouldn't be thought of as your entire platform. Actually, each of these, you can make each offering cover that user interface, that business logic, and that provisioning. So with Waypoint, for example, you may have 3 very different offerings that each require a user interface, business logic, and provisioning. So with Waypoint Access, you may be providing the server with access tokens, invite tokens for users as they want to gain access. With a Waypoint environment, you may be talking about a whole new cluster that the Waypoint can deploy to, and what does that look like configuring? And with the Waypoint application, you may be looking at a microservices style architecture at your organization, and you want to provide a quick start for a new application. Each of these comes with their own complexity of how to add that business logic to make this happen and where to deploy this to. So getting a bit more concrete, what happens when you want to deliver a new environment? Well, you ask Kratix for a new environment using the user form of that custom resource definition, and on demand, that environment is created and tracked through Kratix cataloging. So even more concrete, let's go do a quick 2-minute example of how to add an environment. But first, I'm going to give you a bit of a tour of what is currently on my laptop. So this is just a demo, so it's all going to be local, but we have a couple of kind clusters running. So we can show that with a kubectl of get clusters. And we can see that we have a production and a platform cluster. My command line is showing you that I'm currently running all commands against the platform cluster by default. So what we want to actually see is how we deploy to these 2 different clusters. We talked about in the slides the idea that the server would go to the platform cluster, or the admin cluster, where the runner would live in the environment specific clusters like production. So we can get stateful sets, because that's how Waypoint is deployed, from the Waypoint namespace. And we can see that the Waypoint server has been deployed onto the platform cluster. In contrast, if I run the same command, but I ask that to go against the production cluster, we'll see that we have a runner running there. So we have 1 server running on platform, 1 runner running on production. But that's not enough just to have the servers running. We also need Waypoint to be aware of them. So to do that, what we need to do is log into the Waypoint CLI. So I can log in using a token that I have in the cluster. So and I can take that out using a little bit of JQ magic. And decode that. With that, I'm logged into the Waypoint server, and I can start asking Waypoint questions about what it knows. So I can say, for example, that I want to get what runners does Waypoint have registered. So I can see here that a few minutes ago, we set up a production cluster and that has a runner of ID. That cluster was adopted. So that means that the Waypoint server is aware of it and can schedule to it. Now, just because it's adopted doesn't mean that the scheduling can be done in quite an easy way. Actually, when you're using a Waypoint HCL file, they target not runners, but runner profiles. This allows you to schedule possibly to more than 1 runner setup. And so we need a equivalent profile for this production cluster. Runner profile. Let's go that. So with that, we can see that there's a Kratix production profile. It is pointing at the same runner ID that is the labeled runner in the cluster that is production. So we can see now that we have access to a runner running in a separate cluster that we can target via our Waypoint HCL files. But how do we do this? Obviously, this was all done off screen. I could have done this all manually, but let me show you quickly how I did this using promises. So what are promises? Promises are the domain language of Kratix that describe one of those stacks from user experience as well as business logic, as well as provisioning. All of that kind of encompasses into something that the platform promises to you to offer. We have 4 such promises right now. You can see the Waypoint server was created about 10 minutes ago, and the environment was created about 10 minutes ago as well. These are the things that were actually requested, which resulted in a server running on a platform cluster and the production cluster with the runner being registered. You can see that slightly younger than the environment, we have 2 other promises, an on-demand cluster and a Waypoint runner. This is because the environment is actually a compound promise that manages 2 sub-promises. This is similar to that paved path idea where you may have people that want to request a database, but actually a lot of people are just going to be wanting an application that has a database as well. This is true for environment. You may just want to create a cluster by yourself, or you may want an environment that actually requires that cluster to be created. These promises have corresponding CRDs or custom resource definitions. So if I get the CRDs in this cluster and I limit it just to the ones I've created for this talk, I can see that I have the same number of CRDs as I do promises. One thing to note here is that you can craft that user experience. So I've created a CRD here called Waypoint Invites, even though there isn't a promise called Waypoint Invite. That promise is Waypoint Server, which we offer through invite tokens. This promise is in the marketplace, which I'll share a bit more about later. From there, we can go look more specifically at the environment CRD, since that's what we're going to be using today to be able to request a new staging environment. We can look inside of here at the properties and have proper. I need to just have that be outputted as text. Great, there we go. So we've got the properties now for this custom resource definition. This is where we define what the fields are that users can request and what validations they are. We can see here that we have 2 fields people can provide. They can provide a cluster provider, which has a default value of kind and a very limited pattern, which allows only the number of providers that we offer as a service. So right now we offer kind, vCluster, or GCP, but you can imagine in the future we may offer AWS, or we may offer 2 versions of GCP, and we can add and expand on this option here. The other one is a cluster selector, which gives kind of unbounded access to that, to affect that scheduler. And here it's not required, so it can be left empty. And it also is quite wide open. We kind of just let people pass in keys and value pairs. This is a very kind of broad promise. It is likely that when you have a larger organization, your limitations may be greater, but it's all the same pattern. You can add validations to your fields. You can choose not to expose fields at all and instead just calculate those values. But with this such simple kind of expectations or validations, the request we have to make to generate a staging environment is really quite simple as well. So I can have a look at the resource request for staging here that I'm going to use. And it's so simple, there's actually not even a body to it. I just need to create a type of environment under the HashiTalks API, and I give it a name. That name pulls through to all of those components, including the name of the cluster, the name of the runner profile, all of those things. So I've got this staging environment that I'd like to create, and I can go ahead and apply that. With that applied, I can now see that I've registered a new environment. I can do that by using Kratix to describe what environments have been requested. So if I get environments, I can see that we have 2 environments, one that's a bit older, we talked about production previously existing, and one that's only a few seconds old, that's staging. This will let me, as an operator, manage my real estate to understand what's going on and who's requested and when those requests happened. But it's not just about a request for something. We also have to actually configure and deploy that. And the way that we do that is through a pipeline. So if I get pods here, I can see that I've got 6 pods, one for each for a request pipeline, for the environment, the on-demand cluster, and Waypoint runner. And you can see that they're all duplicated. though 3 of those are more in the 14-minute mark, which matches with when the production cluster was created, and 3 of them are in the last minute, which matches with when I created the staging. You can also see that the environment request pipeline is slightly older than the on-demand and the Waypoint runner one. This again reinforces that I made a request for an environment, which then cascaded down to my sub requests for things like an environment and a runner. These pipelines can take care of generating manifests that can be stored in a declarative way, or any imperative requests that you may need to make. So with these running, I should be getting access to a cluster any second now. Let's see what we can do. So kubectl. There we go. We've got now a 3rd cluster, kind staging. With that, I am able to check the same things I checked previously on production. So I want to see that the stateful set on this staging cluster is only running a runner, which it is, which is fantastic. And I also want to see what runners I've got. I've now got 2 runners. It's been adopted, which is fantastic. It means it's usable, and it's got a label of staging instead of a label of production. Similarly, though, this is only useful if I have a profile. And because production was built in the exact same way, we are confident that we ended up with a Kratix staging runner profile pointing at the Kratix staging, or the staging labeled Waypoint runner. And at this stage, in just a minute or 2 after a request, I managed to create a whole new environment with Waypoint running and provide access to that to my application engineers without a long ticket method and everything else, which is it builds that great application developer experience that Waypoint provides, and moves that as well to provide a great operator experience to the platform team. So just to return here real quick, that's really all I have for you today. So what comes next? Kratix is a free and open source tool. I'd love to work with you if you are someone who needs to self-host Waypoint and help you manage it across your estate, whether that be Kubernetes or otherwise. And so to get started, we have a marketplace. Right now, the Waypoint promise in there is one of those 3 offerings. It's the one around deploying the server and providing access to invite tokens. But obviously, we've got environments and applications that we've been playing around with. And we'd love to work with you if that's something that would be helpful. So hit me up, either email Kratix or Abby at syntasso.io, or you can find me. My handles are in the bottom right corner. Waypoint's super exciting for application developers, and we want to make it equally exciting for any platform engineers that need to offer it in-house. Thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate being a part of the HashiTalks day today, and I hope you have a fantastic rest of the event. Thanks so much.